Alright, welcome back. So we're in Unit 4 now and we're in the first screencast, and this is the point of the course where we go from the kind of theoretical, trying to understand the basics of things, to the application of a lot of the ideas that we've seen. So this is the part of the course where we start thinking about, what do we do with all this information? What's the point of all this information? And hopefully you'll experience some payoff having gone through understanding how we measure the economy and how the economy works. This is the application of those ideas. So I want to give you the basic idea, and this first screencast is about really introducing what's coming next. The basic idea is essentially the concept that the economy acts a lot like a machine, in that it can work or not, it can break down or not, and the idea that we can manipulate this machine by turning various dials or adjusting various settings to make the economy better or worse. And this whole idea, and in fact the entire model that you learned about in the last unit, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, was invented by one pretty amazing guy. His name was John Maynard Keynes, and he was around in the time period you could see on the screen. And basically everything you've seen so far has been a product of basically his brain. He was the guy that came up with the idea of aggregate demand, aggregate supply, full employment. The entire model that you saw in the last unit was created straight out of his skull. And so was the idea that the economy can actually be understood, that the economy could actually be managed. And so in a large part, especially liberals living these days, they owe a lot to this guy. Because this guy was basically the guy who came up with the idea in the first place that it might be the government's job to make the economy better. Now, I should say that there's all sorts of people on the other side of the ideological divide, more free market, laissez-faire type people, who don't see the economy this way. They see the economy not really like a machine. They see the economy as kind of being like a force of nature. And for them, managing the economy is going to be as successful as one would be in trying to manage the wind or manage the tides. It's just impossible. But not for Keynes. Keynes basically thought you could manage the economy, specifically the government could manage the economy and make life better for all of us. So that's what fiscal policy is. The idea that the government can and should do things to make the economy better when it's bad. Alright, now the reason that our government does fiscal policy is because it has to. There's a couple of legislative mandates, laws that require the government to do this thing called fiscal policy, manage the economy. And the most important one was the Employment Act of 1946, which basically said that the government's job, in part, is to achieve full employment and to do it in a non-inflationary kind of way. Now the problem is the government isn't made up of economists. The government is made up of politicians. So to help those politicians, the government has appointed a couple of different groups to help the people in power, people in Congress and the president, achieve the three goals for the three variables that have set, we've talked about. Remember, here are our three variables: unemployment, inflation, and GDP, and there's some range that we want to see those things in. Again, we kind of consider full employment 5 to 6%. There's some argument over whether that's the right number. Maybe the number should be a little bit higher now, maybe 6 to 7%, but that's roughly the range. Inflation, we want to see it roughly 1 to 2%, maybe 3%, and GDP growth for a modern, advanced, industrialized economy, 3, 4, 5%, something like that. If the economy isn't there, it's the government's job to try to get us there. So to help out the president, who isn't always an economist, there's a group, their name is the Council of Economic Advisors, and it's basically a bunch of economists that advise the president. On the congressional side, there's another group called the Joint Economic Committee, whose task is to do the same thing, but for Congress as opposed to the president. And I realize all this stuff is relatively boring, but you need to know that that's why the government does fiscal policy. Other than the fact that it's a good idea, they do it because they have to do it, and they have these groups to help them out. Now, to understand fiscal policy, we kind of have to go back to the model that you were learning about in the last unit, the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. And remember just a couple of things about it. Remember, the aggregate supply has the three basic segments, the three basic shapes. Horizontal, that's where we're in a recession. the upward sloping as we approach full employment, and the vertical part, which represents the absolute capacity of the economy to produce things. Remember, aggregate demand is a downward sloping line, and the importance of these two curves is where they meet. Where the aggregate demand curve crosses the aggregate supply curve, we have equilibrium. And it's that equilibrium that determines what price level is going to be, it determines what GDP is going to be, and it determines what employment is going to be. That's all last unit stuff. You remember that there's a special place in this graph that we want the economy to be, a place that we want aggregate demand to be crossing aggregate supply, and that's at full employment. Full employment GDP, that's what we want for the economy. Again, that amount of stuff that would be produced if we had full employment, if we're at that 5 to 6% range of unemployment. So, the official definition of fiscal policy, it is the government's attempt to influence the economy by shifting aggregate demand. That's the mechanism in this model that the government uses to make the economy better. By moving that aggregate demand curve, and there's two things the government can do specifically that cause that aggregate demand curve to move. The first thing the government could do is simply change how much money it is that the government spends. Again, we've called that G, government spending. And that can be government spending on anything. Tanks, planes, roads, construction, beanie babies, it doesn't really matter. That's money that's going to be pushed out into the economy, spent and respent according to MPC and what the multiplier looks like. And that all is going to make a aggregate demand change. If the government spends more money, aggregate demand shifts to the right. The second tool that the government has is taxation, the level of taxation and whether it raises or cuts taxes. And if you think about our model and the equation we've been working in, government spending is pretty obvious. Government spending is G, and the government has control over what G is, so by spending more or less money, the government can make GDP go up or down. Taxes work a little bit more indirectly. Taxes affect how much consumers spend. Taxes take away from people's disposable income. So by raising taxes, we can reduce C, and by lowering taxes or cutting taxes, the government can increase C. So there are the two tools, essentially, that the government can use to move the aggregate demand curve and therefore move where equilibrium is and therefore move the economy from one place to the other. And it's important at this point to point out that it's these two tools that are constantly being argued over in any kind of political debate, depending on what side of the divide you sit on. So if you're a liberal and you think about these two tools, government spending, everything else being equal, you tend to like. You tend to like programs for the poor, you tend to like education programs, environmental programs. You see a relatively large role for the government in society, and so for you, increased government spending is almost always a good thing. On the other hand, in terms of taxation, it's liberals who typically like to raise taxes to pay for these programs, and specifically, and especially raise taxes on relatively wealthy people. So for liberals, they don't mind seeing government spending go up often, and they also don't mind seeing taxes go up often. Now you could look at those same two tools through the perspective of conservatives, or typically Republicans, and they feel exactly the opposite way. They don't like government spending for all sorts of reasons, and they don't like taxes for all sorts of reasons. And so they're going to use these two tools differently than a liberal or a Democrat might use these tools. And this is constantly popping up. I mean, you can basically boil down almost any political debate into some derivation of what's going to happen in terms of how much money the government spends and how the government's going to pay for that spending. All right, so the bottom line here is this idea that the economy can be managed. It's like a broken down car when it breaks down, and you can bring it to the mechanic called the government, who has various wrenches, tools, right, called government spending and taxes, that it could use to try to fix the economy. Again, there are other economists out there who do not think that, but this is the basic assumption of macroeconomics, and it's the assumption we're going to be going with until we start to expose ourselves to some of those other views. All right, that's the intro. Nothing else to say about that.
This is a very unusual sight. A sloth in a hurry. It wants to defecate, and the only place it's happy doing that, oddly enough, is down on the ground. It only does it about once a week. But why does it come down to the ground to do it? And why does it nearly always choose to do so in exactly the same place?